this presentation, we're going to be looking at adaptations and ecology of marine mammals. So to start off with, we have three different orders that marine mammals belong to. The sirenians consist of manatees and dugongs. The carnivores are going to be made up of eared seals and true seals and other associated organisms. And the cetaceans are going to be the group we largely think of as marine mammals, such as whales and dolphins. So let's first look at sirenians. I mentioned there's a couple different representative species that we often think of with sirenians. The dugong over on the left-hand side, and the manatee over on the right-hand side. Perhaps the manatee is a little bit more common in our thinking of these types of animals. The manatee is going to be found in fresh and salt water, but the dugongs are only going to be found in salt water. Another kind of example of one of these extinct members of this group is the stellar sea cow, which is represented in the bottom left-hand corner, and this animal unfortunately was hunted to extinction in the 18th century. So they're going to be about the same length, but the manatees are going to weigh slightly larger, at about 880 to 1,300 pounds as opposed to 500 to about 1,100 pounds with the dugong. They are going to have different tail structures. The rounded, more flat structure of the manatee caudal fin or tail fin is going to be different in comparison to the dugongs, which look more like a whale or a dolphin tail. The average lifespan of the manatees is much shorter, by 40 years as compared to 70 years for the dugong, but generally they're going to have a lot of other characteristics in common, such as, generally they're going to prefer vegetation and things along those lines. Now the carnivores or pinnipeds are going to be largely broken into these three groups of seals, sea lions, and walruses. However, we also find that polar bears and sea otters belong to this group. Now, you might not immediately be thinking of them as marine mammals, but a marine mammal is defined as an organism or an animal that's going to be dependent on the sea for its food and have somewhat of a similar evolution to them. So polar bears and otters both do depend on the ocean for their food. So that's what kind of lumps them into this group of marine mammals. Now, if we take a look at the evolutionary kind of relationship between these organisms, in the top panel, you can see that we have an example of the seals. On the far right, the Odobenidae is going to be the walrus, which is in the top panel, the next to the left. The Odoriidae is going to be the sea lions, and then we've got the polar bears, and at the far end is going to be those sea otters. So if we look at it in terms of a monophyletic relationship, then we see that there's a close relationship in those polar bears to the seals, the sea lions, the walruses, and the seals. And then if we take a look at these organisms or these animals in relation to one another in another perspective, we still find, by looking at different characteristics, we still find that they have similarities that allow them to be closer to one another. So just with phylogenetic trees, you can have the tree structured differently if you're looking at it in a genetic perspective versus physical characteristics. But either way, when you have two representations of these phylogenetic relationships, we still end up with these bears and the sea otters being close in relationship to the seals, walruses, and sea lions. But the group of marine mammals we all tend to think of more commonly are cetaceans, which are whales and dolphins. And there's approximately 90 species of whales and dolphins that we are aware of that consist of either toothed cetaceans, which we refer to as odontocetes, versus the baleen whales, which are the mysticetes. And I should mention that there's approximately 90 species. However, even recently, we've still had discoveries of new species of whale, believe it or not. This is in reference to a new species of beaked whale that was found just just in 2020, so not that long ago, about a year and a bit ago. And we've also, well, within the marine mammal community, there's also been hybrids that end up of different whales that people are unsure of their actual species, and then if a whale beaches itself, or if you get enough of these samples, genetic samples from hybrids, it turns out sometimes they're actually different enough that they're a different subspecies of whale. So occasionally you will hear stories of new species of marine mammals being discovered. This is large in part due to the fact that they are challenging to study, and it is also difficult to, basically get around to all the different habitats that these animals live in. So unfortunately, although we are increasing occasionally the number of species that we're aware of, we are also experiencing within the marine mammal world a loss of biodiversity. And a good example of that, unfortunately, is the vaquita, which is a species of porpoise that lives in Mexico in the Gulf of California. And this animal is essentially very close to extinction, unfortunately. So as that number of 90 different species will vary a little bit over time. If we take a look at the phylogenetic relationship between these animals, you can see that there is a strong relationship here between these toothed organisms and, or the toothed cetaceans and animals such as a cow and sheep and things along those lines. We also see that relationship between, and this phylogenetic tree just has toothed animals, so it doesn't have our baleen whales on it. But if we take a look at the relation or the distance in this phylogenetic tree between these whales and dolphins and the walruses and the manatee, you can see that they're quite far phylogenetically. They're not very close relatives. And I think this one is based on, this has to do with genetic samples as well. So you can see that the manatee is most closely related to an elephant, whereas the walrus is going to be a closer relative to cats and horses and things along those lines. And bottlenose dolphin killer whales are going to be more closely related to cows, sheep, and pigs. So despite the fact that we have these animals that seemingly should belong together because they have the same habitat, the fact that they have some of these similarities in structures is more due to convergent evolution than the fact that they have a common recent ancestor. So in looking at the behaviors of these animals, behaviors can consist of either social behavior or sleeping, which is where they're going to shut down about half of their brain at a time. That's commonly thought how they are able to manage sleeping. Migration, feeding, and acoustic behavior. And migration patterns of whales is going to be, and dolphins, it's going to be the distance that they travel between the breeding and the feeding grounds. I've got a couple different examples for you here. But in this example, we have Australia and Antarctica, and the orange lines here are representing the migration paths taken by humpback whales. The kind of teal lines here are representing the paths taken by the southern right whales. The blue is representative of breeding grounds, so the blue kind of blotches surrounding Australia, and the yellow is representative of the feeding grounds. So the way that people are able to determine this is because of the fact that they won't see feeding behaviors in these breeding grounds, and they will see the occurrence of calves within these regions. So luckily, due to the fact that we have the ability to study these animals through shipboard surveys, aerial surveys, drones, tags, and other means, acoustics and other means, we can figure out what their behaviors are going to be in these different regions. As you can see, the migration paths for some animals are going to be quite short, such as for the southern right whales, whereas the humpback whales are going to travel longer distances. They actually kind of move beyond this and go on to South Pacific regions as well for the humpback whales. Another example is the migratory route of the humpback whale is in this figure here. In this, however, we have more of a global scale that we're looking at. So we do have In that last picture, we saw that there are some feeding grounds now represented by the blue and breeding grounds represented by the pink. So we do have some southern ocean feeding grounds that are whales are going to migrate to these breeding grounds. However, you have an entirely different population of whales that have the same kind of difference in feeding versus breeding grounds, but are going to travel within the northern latitudes. So for a whole other population of humpback whales, I should say, you see that the feeding grounds are going to be in the highest northern latitudes, and those breeding grounds are going to, again, be close to the equator. So despite the fact that we have these similarity in species, we find that with different populations, it is very easy to see how that genetic information could be isolated in the populations in the northern latitudes versus the populations in the southern latitudes, which could give rise to different species and kind of drive that speciation and isolation of the genetic material between these populations, leading to different species. So I guess it's not that surprising, given that we have this separation really of populations of the same species of animals. Gray whales have one of the longest migration routes. They start up in the northern latitudes here, up in Alaska and the Chukchi Sea, and they're going to feed within these regions in this little strait here, and just kind of on the top end of Canada, top end of Canada there, and will travel all the way down along the coast, and their mating and calving grounds are going to be located just off of Mexico. So I'm sure you've seen footage of gray whales and their new offspring, and from here, the reason why they travel close to the shore, which makes them great for whale watching, is because of the fact that it allows them to have safety in hugging the shoreline, safety from animals, predators such as, specifically killer whales and sharks. So by staying close to that area, they can kind of shelter in and close to the shorelines. So huge routes that these and ranges that these animals are covering throughout the world's oceans there. Just one last example is the North Atlantic right whale, which has its calving grounds down off of Florida and whatnot in the southern states, and has feeding grounds up in the upper latitudes. So you kind of see this trend. In the upper latitudes, there's going to be feeding grounds in the north and breeding grounds closer to the warmer waters in the southern, as it goes southerly, and the opposite occurs in the southern latitudes. So feeding behavior is going to be different for toothed versus baleen whales. And if we take a closer look here, on the left-hand side is an example of the different structures of teeth that the odontocetes can have. That structure of the tooth is going to be directly related to the type of food that they're going to eat, although for the most part it's going to be squid and fish, right? But for instance, the harbor porpoise are going to eat small fish, so they're going to have a little bit more smaller and pointed of a tooth. The baleen is a structure that looks a little bit feathery and is keratinized and is going to have this fringe kind of structure to it alongside a harder kind of plate. And the size of that baleen is going to also relate to the type of food that they eat. So bowhead whales, for instance, are skim feeders, so they just kind of skim off the surface and are mostly going to feed on plankton. And so they have more of this feathery kind of structure here, this fringe structure, as opposed to the solid portion of the plate being present. Whereas the blue whale, which is going to feed on small crustaceans and other fish, are going to have a bit larger and wider of a plate so that they can kind of retain and keep those larger structures trapped within their mouth. We see a behavior here called bubble netting in humpback whales, and this amazing behavior is where all the whales encircle fish with a series of bubbles, and then they dive up in the middle of that bubble net, of that kind of circle of bubbles that they've created. So you imagine them swimming around in a circle, creating a bunch of bubbles. Then they dive down deep and they'll come up in the middle. All of them will kind of pop up in the middle and just consume all the fish that are trapped within that bubble because they think they're stuck. They're not able to pass through that bubble barrier. It's a really interesting behavior that they've developed that help them in their either singular or group feeding. As you can see, they kind of grab a mouthful, let all the water filter out, and they have these pleats along the bottom of their mouth that allow it to expand. Crazy. Oh, everybody's going for that one. The other interesting thing about this is you can see there's a couple other different species here that are hunting at the same time. The birds, there's a sea lion in there. So this really effective strategy is beneficial for more than just the humpback whales as well. So as you can see, the behaviors are going to be driven by, feeding, right? So necessity drives a lot of those behaviors. Also, the physiological structures and adaptations of these specific cetaceans are going to be useful strategies for hunting as well. For example, they can use echolocation clicks in order to find their prey. And what happens is they use the sound or the reflection from sound in order to determine a distance to that prey. For species such as sperm whale that have perfected this and use echolocation clicks regularly in their hunting, they have a very special structure to their head. It's going to have something called a spermaceti organ here, which is basically just made of oil. And they'll produce a click at the little structure here called the monkey lips. That echolocation click, which is a broadband sound that allows for acoustic reflection quite well, that echolocation click will travel all the way back through this spermaceti organ, through this structure. It will get reflected and transfer out and kind of basically go through the skull of this animal and go out into the ocean there. Now, this spermaceti organ is amplifying it. So you've got this oil that's whole purpose is to amplify that click and make it louder. And then you've got that sound traveling out. It bounces off of a fish or a squid, more likely for a sperm whale. It travels back to them and it's received in this lower jaw where there's a series of little air pockets. And those air pockets make it possible for that sound to travel and be received in this ear bone. Then there's going to be, their brain's going to translate, I don't know how, but translate a distance to that actual prey. They can use this same method or mechanism for navigating their habitat as well. So let's just take a look at how much a blue whale eats a day. Now, as you can see in this figure, we have a blue whale along the top, which can get up to about 32 meters, a humpback whale in the middle, which can get up to about 15 meters, and a shark, great white shark that is located in the very, the third animal down, which gets up to about 6 meters in length. And if we were to put humans, like a standard, 5.5, 6 foot person, you would have quite a few of those in order to equate to the length of all of these different species. We know that one blue whale weighing 200 tons would be equivalent to approximately a little over 2,600 humans weighing 70 kilograms, or about 40 elephants, each weighing 5 tons. So imagine how much food needs to be ingested by this animal in order to allow it to get to that size and maintain that size. The amount of food it takes to fill its stomach is 2,200 pounds. The amount of food consumed at its peak consumption, so when it's, at the height of its feeding period, is 8,000 pounds. And then we have this little krill here, which is going to have an average weight of 0.07 ounces. And remember, 16 ounces equal a pound. So we would need to determine the weight of krill in pounds to fill the stomach. and the weight of krill in pounds per day consumed at the peak consumption period. So I'll give you a second to see if, maybe pause your video now if you'd like, so you can try and work out how much krill a blue whale would need to eat per day. Okay, so moving on to the answer. So first you'd have to work out, well, the correct answer would be that it would take about little over 503,000 krill in order to feed or to fill the stomach of that whale, just based on the amount of pounds, taking the weight of those krill and the amount of pounds that it takes to fill the stomach. So next, if we wanted to look at the amount of krill that it's eating per day to fill the stomach at the peak of its feeding, it equates to about 1.8 million krill to fill the stomach. So huge volume of these krill, which actually we can use this active method of acoustics in order to work out where you have these swarms of krills that kind of look like the little image over here to the left, and in a larger bloom look at like the image in the top right here. So huge amount of krill in order to kind of allow these organisms to be able to eat every day. But luckily, krill exist in the thousands, in the billions and millions of organisms. So blue whales need to live in those areas where they're going to be most productive, and that's largely in southern oceans as well as regions where there's high productivity. So the Southern Ocean krill abundance is about 500 million tons, as per the Antarctic.gov, Antarctic government in Australia website. So the amount of krill used commercially includes krill for pharmaceutical uses and also for health food, as well as krill harvested for feeding fish farms, which is interesting. So approximately 1% of the biomass, or 600,000 tons, is harvested annually by humans or used for our own purposes. So it's interesting how, really it is important to keep the health of these stocks in mind, as well as keep an idea on the population or abundance for these krill in order to make sure that there's enough for blue whales as well as other species, and enough to be able to support these markets as well. Scientists also study the acoustic behavior of animals in order to understand characteristics of their social interactions as well as feeding behaviors. And in these images, we'll just step through a couple examples of some of the vocalizations that these animals can make. So in this particular example for a bottlenose dolphin, we have time along the x-axis and we have frequency along the y-axis. The human hearing range is anywhere from about 20 hertz to about 20 or 25 kilohertz or so we can hear within this range. And the frequency really just has to do with the pitch. So if it's a high-pitched sound or a low-pitched sound. The intensity or the amplitude of a call in these figures is represented by the kind of intensity of the color. So the brighter that color, the louder the sound is, and the darker kind of deeper purples are indicating that there's less sound present. And then when you see kind of a specific kind of, like here we have this whistle, when you see that, it means that there's, a sound that's occurring. It can either look like that whistle, or it can be kind of layered or harmonic looking sounds. There's quite a variety. So I'll just go ahead and play a couple of these for you so you get an idea of what these sounds are that we're looking at. So this first one I'll just play part of. Now in this one, after that long kind of whistle, you heard a couple of these kind of creaking sounds. That was a series of echolocation clicks. They can produce whistles, moans, and echolocation clicks are used predominantly for finding food, but also can be used for kind of, feeding behaviors or social behaviors. Now, if we go to our next Example here, we have a fin whale call. Fin whale calls can be very low, so about 20 hertz, but also they can make these higher frequency sounds. Basically, there's a harmonic happening here. So there's a fundamental and then a harmonic based on that fundamental. So here these calls are around 200 hertz, and this is what they sound like. So kind of like a, I don't know what you'd call that. It sounds a little funny. It's also funny because these animals are so big and yet they produce such low frequency sounds. Another kind of interesting fact is that blue whales produce sounds that are below our hearing threshold, so we wouldn't be able to hear a blue whale sound despite them being the largest animal on Earth. Next we have an example of a gray whale. It's a little bit different from the others. Almost sounds like his stomach is kind of gurgling there in the middle there. Another example is our humpback whale. This is probably a little more familiar of a whale sound to you. This example is humpback whale song, but they also produce social sounds as well. And then finally, we have an example of those echolocation clicks I was telling you that sperm whales produce in order to kind of track down their prey. So these broadband kind of sounds, they sound just like clicks. And here's what they sound like. Kind of like just snapping your fingers, right? So yeah, this just gives an idea of the diversity of calls that they can make. And scientists can study these calls to either determine the distribution of these animals, whether they're present or not in an area. They can go so far as to determine the density and abundance in some instances with the right configuration of hydrophones, and yeah, a lot more. So it's a lot of interesting work being done in acoustics. Next, we are going to talk a little bit about the physiology of these animals. These animals are unique because they can survive in various temperatures. They can balance air consumption and buoyancy. They're able to have streamlined body form that helps them deal with resistance in the water, and they can osmoregulate. They have a mechanism for osmoregulation. So if we take a look at the anatomy of a dolphin here, you can see that their form is going to be very streamlined. So it allows water to quickly flow along the outsides of these structures such that they're not going to slow them down. Similar to how a plane is aerodynamic, we see this same kind of structure, although they're hydrodynamic, not aerodynamic, in these dolphins and whales. They can get very fast with bursts of speed up to 25 to 30 miles per hour, although their typical speeds are generally going to be between 8 and 10 miles per hour for this dolphin. The other thing to note is that there's a lot of similarity in the internal structures here. Another indication that they are more closely related to terrestrial or animals. One funny little thing is this pelvis here. Despite the fact that they don't have a use for it, it still has a remnants of a structure from their most recent terrestrial ancestor. They also have a mechanism for maintaining heat and keeping their metabolism steady. That is using this very, very thick layer of blubber, which is similar but a little bit different in terms of the intracellular structure to fat. The blubber is going to be a little bit more interconnected, so it'll be a little bit stronger in nature. And here we have a cross-section of that blubber. You can see that there's different depths and layers to that blubber as well. And you have connective tissue along the inside and then a dermal layer or skin layer along the top. So that's going to help to keep you do lose heat about 10 times faster in water than you do on land. So this blubber layer is going to help them to maintain that heat. There is a mechanism by which they are able to kind of thermoregulate a bit, and that's because that allows their blood to cool down. Because there is no blubber surrounding their pectoral flippers, their blood is able to circulate through there, cool down a bit, and then return internally. So what was I going to say? With blubber, it insulates the dolphin body, but not the flippers. So in some instances where they're diving and they stop this circulation, they're going to maintain their heat as well. Now, diving physiology is a really, really unique element to these animals and adaptation in these animals. There's a variety of depths that marine mammals can dive to. Sea otters are going to dive down for about 4 to 5 minutes and only about 200 feet. Northern elephant seals, that should be 5,000 feet, can dive down to about 5,000 feet and stay under a little bit longer. Woodall seals can dive down for about an hour and a quarter and about 1,900 feet. That might be updated by now, actually. Baleen whales stay shallow, around 300 feet, and toothed whales, such as dolphins, will dive for about 20 to 30 minutes, and only to about 1,000 feet, whereas sperm whales and beaked whales can dive for over an hour and very, very deep. So in this figure, you can kind of see the deepest diver is this, on record, is this Cuvier's beaked whale, which is Zivius cavarostris here, and there's varying degrees of depths that other animals are able to dive down to. Now, of course, this is going to be strategic for them, right? There's different food at these different water depths, but also if you have a top predator of killer whale and it can only dive down to about 400 meters, then you have an advantage. If they can swim faster than you, then you have an advantage if you can dive deeper than them. So that's kind of the purpose in that particular adaptation. Now, gas exchange is really important in these animals. It's a very quick process. It's a 2-second kind of system where they exhale and inhale again. And during that process, about 80 to 90% of the gas in their air in their lungs is going to be exchanged, as compared to about 10 to 20% in humans. They're going to, in this figure here at the very bottom, can see that this is a dive profile for Zivius cavarostris, so that Cuvier's beaked whale. And we have time along the x-axis and then depth along the y-axis. The purple line is representing the dive path of that particular animal. But interestingly enough, they will do shallow dives. Before a deep dive, they'll do a series of these shallow dives or a longer kind of shallow dive, and then come to the surface, breathe a few times, and then do a deep dive. And that helps just to basically get all of the, handle all of their gas exchange. The other thing that's important is you see that this dive down is a lot steeper than the dive up. Well, it's a little less steeper. The reason for this slow dive up or ascent into the surface there is going to be important for handling any nitrogen that may have built up in their body. So the other important thing to note is that their oxygen is going to be stored in hemoglobin and myoglobin in the blood and myoglobin in the muscle, and that's the case with all marine mammal or all mammals, but they have a larger percentage of that stored up in their myoglobin. Also, their lungs are able to collapse and push air into the windpipe, which prevents less nitrogen buildup in the tissues. And then finally, heart rate reduction is an important aspect of their being able to dive so deep. It reduces to 10 to 20%, and there's a reduced blood flow to the extremities as well. So in this particular figure, you see a dolphin over on the left-hand side near the surface or with a shallow dive will maintain a large reservoir of gas in the lungs. When it gets deeper to about 50 meters or so, they will exhale before diving, and the lungs will collapse about then. That's a horrible picture, but and it will also cut off blood flow to the lungs during the dive. So a couple different strategies for shallow water as opposed to deeper water dives. Finally, water regulation is an important aspect of them being able to kind of regulate their internal versus external environment. They don't drink water, but they are able to extract all the water that they need from their food. So that helps them because it means they don't have this large influx or concentration of salt water that they need to kind of get rid of. And then finally, milk production and nursing in marine mammals is slightly unique. Calves are going to consume between 10 to 20% of their body weight per day, and in some cases, whales will produce 150 gallons per day of milk to accommodate that. And the fat concentration is going to be quite a bit higher in marine mammals as compared to terrestrial mammals. It ranges, depending on the species, from 35 to about 50% fat. And just to give you a point of comparison, that fat content's about 19% in deer and about 4.5% in humans. So obviously they have this thick blubber layer that they need to build up quickly to survive in the water in an aquatic environment. So being able to have that fat concentration very high in the milk is an important aspect of their survival. And in this little video, we see just an example of a calf nursing from its mom. There are mammary slits that are located towards the back and bottom of the female, and the calf will just kind of rub up next to them. The mom will sense that the calf is needing to feed. I'll go back here a little bit. Shows a little bit better of an example. And the calf just goes up and gets a quick little drink of milk and then swims away. So you can see it here again. The reason why then that fat concentration needs to be high might also have to do with the fact that there's such a small percentage that's going to be passed along to the calf during each of those, oh there it is, super quick, during each of those attempts at feeding. So they, obviously they're swimming in the water, they can't stay, they can't feed for long. All right, and I hope that provided you with a good idea of how marine mammals are able to survive successfully in a marine environment.